Hello, it's Wednesday, the 19th of April, 2017 at 1 o'clock Eastern Time, and this is Student Affairs Live, the online learning community for student affairs educators. I'm your host, Heather Shea from Michigan State University, and my pronouns are she, her, and hers. On today's live broadcast, I am talking with ACPA leaders about the new Racial Justice Strategic Imperative. Before I introduce my guests, I need to give a quick shout out to all of the folks who make these free webcasts possible. Student Affairs Live is a part of the Higher Ed Live network. Our episodes offer you direct access to the best and brightest minds in education. Be a part of our live broadcast by sharing your knowledge, and you can even participate in the discussion and asking questions today by tweeting to us using the hashtag HigherEdLive. Thank you as always to the wonderful Alex Sylvester, who is again moderating our back channel today. All of our episodes are free and easy to access in the video archives at higheredlive.com, and you can also subscribe to our iTunes podcast. Today's episode is made possible by ACPA, College Student Educators International. Support for Student Affairs Live is one of the many ways that ACPA provides innovative professional development. You can visit myacpa.org to discover other personal and professional development opportunities. And we are produced by mStoner, a digital-first agency committed to tailored solutions that drive real results. Trusted by thousands of higher ed professionals, mStoner webinars are jam-packed with timely, strategic, and actionable knowledge. Check out their library of on-demand content from digital storytelling to myth-busting websites. We're tweeting out a link to that now. On with the episode. So last month, before the ACPA annual convention, the governing board unveiled a bold new strategic initiative for racial justice in the association. Then in Columbus, the leadership held a series of imagining sessions in which they listened, discussed, and learned from the membership. I had the opportunity to participate in one of these imagining sessions, and I left feeling very hopeful about the direction that the association will pursue over the next time period, working with student affairs educators on this bold new initiative, and also developing competencies that we can use in our roles on campus and in larger society. So I wanted to bring this conversation to a wider audience, and so on today's episode, I'm thrilled to be joined by the ACPA Presidential Trio, past President Donna Lee, President Stephen John Quaye, Vice President Jamie Washington, as well as the immediate past Director of Equity and Inclusion, Dian Squire. Welcome to all of you.
Thank you.
Thank you for making time out of your busy schedules. So for those of you, again, who are watching live, if you have questions, please use the hashtag. We've already had a couple come in, and I will do my best to incorporate those. So for our introductions, I'd love to start by asking each of you to introduce yourselves besides the ACPA volunteer leadership roles that I've already named. What else do you do in your free time when you're not doing ACPA work? And then I'd love also for you to talk about how you personally connect to the topic or idea of racial justice. And Donna, I think we're going to start with you today.
Good, thank you so much. And Heather, thank you for giving us the space to have this important conversation. So I'm Donna Lee. My pronouns are she, her, hers. And I'm currently serving as the Vice President for Student Affairs at Macalester College in St. Paul, Minnesota. And when I think about racial justice, I imagine a world in which our interactions as a people are beyond those that are from a place of tolerance to those that are from a place of affirmation and understanding. I imagine a world in which all people, whites, non-whites, native-born, immigrants, are not just simply tolerated, they are valued, understood, differences and similarities are recognized, acknowledged, and welcomed, and a world in which my son, Jonathan, a young Black male, can show up fully as his best, his whole, his beautiful self.
I don't know how anybody else is going to speak more eloquently than you, Donna. Thank you so much for sharing that.
Thank you.
Jamie.
All right, thank you. I am Jamie Washington. My pronouns are he, him, his. In addition to serving in ACPA as the Vice President, When I'm not doing that, it doesn't seem like I'm not doing that at any time these days. But my role is as the president of the Washington Consulting Group, and the president and co-founder of the Social Justice Training Institute. And I also have the pleasure of serving as a pastor of a Unity Fellowship Church here in Baltimore. So my life kind of engages and touches this topic in many different ways. That is specifically through the work that I have done in higher education for more than 30 years, with colleges and universities, and today with businesses and organizations as well. And when I come to this topic, I also am very much aware that it's not just a topic that I engage in higher ed spaces. I also look at what I live every day and what people live every day in my church community. And as we consider this notion of racial justice, it does sit alongside for me very closely with social justice. There is no social justice without racial justice. And so as I engage this, much of what Donna said, I'm in complete agreement with. It is about us being willing to engage the fact that we cannot create, there would be no need for racial justice if injustice did not exist. And so a willingness to own, how has injustice shown up in our institutions? How does it matter and show up in our lives? What are the things that we are conscious of and unconscious of, and ways in which that we might show up with students, faculty, and staff, and others that we connect with that don't support all of us living and contributing to our full potential. Mm-hmm. Similarly to Donna, I entered this space with children in mind. As a grandfather of 7 and a great uncle to 6, the world that I want for them is one where they can fully be who they are. And as I talk about those 13, there is a diversity in terms of their racialized experience. How they will get seen as they walk the planet won't all be the same. And so as I engage with my multiracial grandchildren and my monoracial grandchildren and great nieces and nephews, their experience is different. And I want them to be able to talk about that and live in a world where they still get valued regardless of what that difference is.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Jamie. Stephen, welcome.
Thanks, Heather. Hi, everyone. So I think for me, let me also talk about what I do. So aside from being president of ACPA, I also serve as a faculty member at Miami University in the Student Affairs and Higher Education program. I think for me, I come to racial justice from the place of a couple of things. Much like Donna, I have a 6-year-old multiracial child and whose name is Sebastian. And I think every day about the world in which he lives in. And wanting that world to be one in which he's able to move through the world boldly in all of his identities and not be afraid of being told he can't do this or that, or being afraid just to live as all of who he is on a daily basis. So I think a lot about that. I had a conversation with Sebastian recently where we were talking about the fact that I don't like guns. I don't like him to play with toy guns. And so he was wondering why, if that's the case, why do police officers have guns? And so we had a conversation about policing, and I used it as an opportunity for me to talk with him for the first time about policing among Black and brown folks. And, you know, he's 6. I don't know that he fully comprehended what I was saying, but I also wanted to be the first person in his life to have that conversation with him, that unfortunate conversation. And so for me, the mere fact that I have to have that conversation is where I enter racial justice, knowing that Sebastian is living in a world where, because of his identities, his body, that he likely will be policed very differently. And because of me and my darker skin color, I'm policed very differently on a daily basis. So for me, when I think of my identities, I think of myself as an immigrant, Ghanaian, Black person, and an unapologetic, bold Black person, and yet still living in fear and racial battle fatigue about the racism I experience in my Black body. So even though my racism, my Black race is salient for me, and that's usually how I enter racial conversations, I also recognize that I hold other dominant identities as a cisgender heterosexual man who shows up in those identities always as well. One example of that is, because of my schedule as a faculty member, I have the privilege of being able to go to the playground or go to the grocery store in the middle of the day. And often when I do that with Sebastian, it's me and white moms primarily. And just the nature of the hyper visibility I feel in my Black body in those instances, but yet the compliments I get from them about how great it is that I'm spending time with Sebastian at the playground or taking him to the grocery store. And, you know, as a cisgender man, it's like that is my child. Why would I not be doing that? And so for me, like it becomes very apparent to me just the ways in which I get complimented, and that's a privileged identity that I hold that always intersects with this subordinated identity of race that I also hold. And so for me, even though I think daily about what it means to be a Black man and that race is salient for me, I can't ignore those other privileged identities as well, even if I am not asked to think about them as frequently. So for me, that's another piece that I wanted to name around how I enter these racial justice conversations and why it's important for me to think about that and do the work on a daily basis.
Thank you so much, Stephen. Dian, welcome.
Hi, thank you. So my name is Dian Squire. I use he, him, his pronouns. I am a visiting assistant professor at Iowa State University. And as Heather mentioned, I'm the immediate past director of equity and inclusion for ACPA, which is one of the most fulfilling professional opportunities I've had. So I'll echo everything that the rest of the folks said, and I think my investment in racial justice partially comes from my identity as an Asian American person and my historical understandings of the ways that we've been used as a tool for anti-Black racism in our country, as a group that's been called the model minority in order to suppress Black people for the benefit of white supremacy. At the same time, Asian Americans are continually seen as a monolithic group, despite what we know about some ethnic groups, about some disparities, and also the reasons for successes of certain groups in our community. And we also know that racism looks very different for Asian Americans as it does for Black folks, which Stephen alluded to a little bit there. So knowing all of that, I really can't not act. And so as a result, it's important for me to work in solidarity with other groups to dismantle white supremacy. So for me, if we're thinking about what is racial justice, it's the active work we do toward gaining equity in our world, particularly for communities of color, which is pretty broad. It might mean different things for different people, but in particular, our focus here is thinking about the ways that student affairs both reproduces and can act to tear down inequities and dominating systems of whiteness upon which our institutions were built. So when I think about racial justice, there's kind of a lot of different things that I'm considering, but I'm excited to be here with everybody to continue the conversation.
Great, thanks so much, Dian. As a white woman entering this conversation, I just want to thank you all for allowing me to share space with you today. I also have an extremely vested interest as a parent, and so what you all said about your children definitely resonates with me as well. So I'm curious about the origination of this strategic imperative, Donna. Can you, as the past president, I imagine you were there from the beginning, talk a little bit about how this came to be within ACPA?
Thank you. There's no question that we're living in really challenging times right now. And many of us, including myself, have questioned our capacity to make a difference in addressing the atrocities, the violence, the sheer hatred in our communities. I've personally always found strength and inspiration and power within ACPA. It's an association that is driven by a love for students and their learning and their development, preparing that generation to go out and leave meaningful lives and be agents of change in the world. We have a commitment to equity, inclusion, and justice, and this has been our lifeblood throughout our history. We focus not just on understanding what are the problems or what the problems are, but really on identifying solutions. And so it was back in November when we gathered as a leadership team, members of the governing board, members of the assembly, the IO staff, and it was a space to pause, reflect on, who are we as an association? How do we want to show up in a world where there seems to be more questions than there are answers? How can we be a catalyst for change? What matters most to us as an association? And what became very clear in our deliberations is that we're not just committed to justice. At our core, I believe, is a basic understanding of an obligation, to justice. And I want to go back to something that Jamie shared that I think is very much speaks to the same thing, is you can't have social justice without racial justice. And so this emerged, this compelling need to make a difference, to step out boldly as an association, this compelling urge to begin to really address racial justice is what came out of that. We left that retreat, I felt, with a new energy, a passion, a desire to really just roll up our sleeves and get the work done. We know it's not going to be easy. We know that it's going to be a process and it could be messy, but there's a shared commitment to rallying around that.
So Donna, you just spoke, and Jamie also has referenced racial justice existing within social justice, and those two things being interdependent. Dian, can you talk a little bit more about this, elaborating further on the FAQ sheet that many of us received at ACPA? It talks specifically about this, but for folks who weren't there, elaborate a little further for us.
Sure. I guess I'm thinking about, like, we could probably have, there are whole classes talking about race and racism in the country. So I'm gonna maybe give some Dian Squire's notes, and sort of the way that I'm conceptualizing race and racism within this project that we're working on. So for me, I conceptualize race in multiple ways that are very political. So one, I see race as governmental labels that are placed upon groups for the purpose of marginalizing and oppressing certain groups, right, at the benefit of others, predominantly white folks. So namely, groups of color are named as such: Black, Asian American, etc., for the maintenance of white dominance. The history. So we can read many books about this. And particularly we can see this as groups are moved in and out of a white racial category. And so this is one way that race is politicized very specifically. I think race is also political and politicized, and that it's used as a designation by people who identify in those groups as an act of solidarity. So for instance, in some contexts, I might identify as Vietnamese, which is an ethnic or country-based identifier, right? But I will often designate myself, as I did with my introduction, by a pan-ethnic racial group, which is Asian American. And for me, that's a political act to act in solidarity with other ethnic groups that originated in Asia. So I think we see this happening in lots of groups. We see this in, like, Latinx groups as well, and even in some Native groups, I believe. So when I think about racial justice, I think about race as a social construction of the groups that often have material consequences, and as a tool for the maintenance of domination, and as a political tool of resistance. So that's kind of a lot of different maybe descriptions about race there. Going to your original question, we do conceptualize this project as intersectional and inclusive, right? So we enter the space foregrounding and stating that race and racism is what we're focusing on, because quite simply, our country is built upon racist structures. Countries that might be built on class structures, ours was not built specifically on a class structure. It was built on settler colonialism and the destruction of native indigenous peoples' lands, cultures, and communities. And then it was further colonized by engaging in imperial destruction of lands, cultures, and communities of African people, right, who were forced to be slaves in order to produce this country. So white supremacy continues to act on these communities of color today by creating these material barriers to success. And so that's why it's important for us to particularly focus on race and racism at this point. And I think we can do it intersectionally, right? So to take that a little bit further, I guess, we also want to make sure that people know that we all have a race for the reasons that I mentioned earlier, including white people. And so the work of racial and social justice is all of our work. It's intersectional because we all have identities that are linked and they're marginalized or oppressed or privileged, as Stephen mentioned. And I think we can just kind of lay, some things quickly out as like an example, right? So there are Native Indigenous people who are Black. There are Black people who are trans. There are trans people who are first-generation college students who are disabled. There are people who hold all of these identities at one time. So once again, we say, racial justice is social justice and social justice is racial justice. However, we are centering race right now because we understand that this is where, this is how our country started. And this is what we need to be doing as an association.
Excellent. So the other two words that are in the statement is strategic imperative. Jamie, can you talk a little bit about what does a strategic imperative mean within ACPA?
Yeah, so I would like to offer, am I being heard?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I would like to offer strategic imperative within the association is simply that it is on purpose and focused, right? So it is, as we think about anything that we're doing, we know that within our institutions, when we're looking at really moving the needle, that we must get strategic. We must look at the systems, the processes, the ways in which we move this value, this belief, this ideology forward. And so we have to look at systematically how we do that. And that is strategic in movement. Imperative is vital. It is important, it is critical. And I think that given the current context in the last 3 or 4 years, certainly racism has been alive and well. It's not a new thing. And we have begun to see a new resurgence of energy around paying attention. One of the dilemmas I think that we experienced as we moved into President Obama's era is that there's the assumption that race was done and that we have arrived because we had a person of African descent reach the highest office in the country. And, many of you can look back and think back to when those were actual statements that were made. Now, race is over. We are in a post-racial society and all of those things. And as a result of that, I think that folks began to assume that because we had President Obama in this position, as we do in lots of different places, we have someone in position and assume that therefore we don't any longer need to engage in this. So what we know is, as we've worked on other strategic imperatives, and I'm not saying that we used that language before, but we've also gotten focused before. And so we've gotten focused on student learning. We've gotten focused on student development. We've gotten focused on assessment. So we've gotten focused on Title IX. We've gotten focused on accessibility. And so we've been intentional and strategic before. This is not new. What we are saying in this context is that is an association that not only has been committed to social justice, but also committed to paying attention to what is happening in our country and what is happening in our field. So this notion that I often hear that social justice is about more than race. And I often will hear that with folks who want to start at the more than race space, but not do race. And so it's been a way in which we have in the last 15 years avoided having some of the hard conversations that we need to have around race, particularly given our context in the US. So ACPA is taking leadership, not only as an association in student affairs, but for higher education, to say it is time for us, as we do, as Dian said, this intersectional work, and we continue to ground ourselves in social justice. And as Stephen named beautifully, we are all really clear that we're not just raced people. We also live with other identities. It is important for us to be able to pull back and focus in on how we need to engage race. So strategic and vital is what that means as we talk about strategic imperative. My last piece that I'll say around this is, as a founder, one of the founders of Social Justice Training Institute, when we started the Institute back in 1998, our first institute was one where we were really committed to making sure that we were doing social justice work, and we created this 5-day experience, and we're inviting people to focus in on how all of this matters. What we found was, as we were not doing strategically, looking in depth at any particular issue, what got in the way was that we were not focused. And folks continue to say, well, what about? And that derailed our conversations. After 1998's Institute, for the next almost 20 years, we have had a race immersion experience. And that has allowed us to move through 5 days of focusing strategically on race and bringing the learnings from race to all of the other identities in social justice that we care about.
So
And
Stephen,
just to,
yeah, go ahead.
so I appreciate that, Jamie. Just to build off of some of the points that Jamie raised, you know, one of the things that I said in my presidential address, that race is not a curse word. And I think we often are hesitant to name and boldly and explicitly center race. I think it brings up a lot of like fear, hesitancy, avoidance, defensiveness, all of those things that come up. And so I think for us, we are choosing to center race because race is not a curse word, race matters.
That's right.
And so I just wanted to name that. And then the other piece I wanted to name, it's also, so as Donna said, the governing board is the one who, in our conversations, we decided to come up with this strategic imperative. It's also worth naming explicitly that the 4 of us right now on this Higher Ed Live call identify as people of color. 3 of us specifically in the presidential trio are Black. And I just think it's important to name that because we can't escape the reality of what it means for 3 Black people to center race in an association. Like that is a big deal that is worth naming explicitly, because in our Black bodies, given the anti-Blackness rhetoric and anti-Blackness that exists in our society, like naming race in our Black bodies is highly risky.
Yes.
And so I just think it's important to name that, and the way in which we come at this, given our Black identities, is really critical. So I didn't want to leave this conversation without being explicit about the bodies that the 3 of us as past president, and vice president sit at. And then Dian also named his like Asian American identity. So to me, it's no coincidence that you know, that in the identities that we hold, that we think daily about our race. It matters to us, and we're asking other folks to also think daily about it, because it should matter to all of us if we are going to make any progress on racial justice, not only in our association, but in our colleges and universities and society as a whole.
Yeah, I think that that's really an important point, Stephen. And I want you to also speak about that, how we want to make progress. So how do you, as the president currently, intend for this initiative to affect the larger professional field of student affairs? So, you know, beyond just ACPA.
Yeah, so I mean, I think the first thing that I'll start with is to just say that to me, like what I think is really critical around this, of how it affects our field, is that it's important for each of us, as we exist in our various intersected identities with our race as part of those identities, to do some of our own work in this area. So that means not relying upon other people to do the work for us, reading resources from women of color, trans women of color, Native American folks. I mean, there's lots of resources that I think are important for us to read and do some of our own work in this area. The other part that I just wanted to say as well too is that, you know, like we're not going to solve racism during my presidency, nor are we going to solve racism likely in my lifetime, which might be nihilistic to think of the fact that we're not going to solve racism, and so it seems like futile. Like why work towards it then? What gives me hope though is that I don't try to solve or think about racism, nor do I want folks in our association to think of addressing this like in our larger society. What I want folks to think about is like, what can we do tangibly and concretely in our own circles and spheres of influence? So twice a week on Wednesdays and Thursdays, I have 20 students or 30 students who I meet with on a regular basis in my class. Those are the individuals who are within my control, my sphere of influence, who I want to engage around these issues. When I go to convention, I engage one-on-one with lots of people and have conversations with them about this. So I think when we think about our own circles and spheres, that to me is like the place in which we can make change. At least I think so. Mm-hmm. So I don't spend a lot of time, for example, thinking about the next ridiculous thing that President Trump is doing, because the reality is I can't have a conversation with President Trump about race and racism, but I can have a conversation with Sebastian about it, with the students in my class, with my doctoral advisees about this. And I can engage them around these issues so that they can make change and talk to the people in their spheres around this. So for me, that's one piece. And then there are some strategic partnerships I think we can make with NCORE. ACNU has gotten a publication that I think is really critical around this issue. ASH right now, the theme for the conference is Power to the People. As I mentioned, Sean, the current president of ASH, we're doing a presidential symposium around this issue in September. So to me, like, those are the tangible and concrete places that I can think about. But I really want people in our association to think of who are the 4 or 5 people that you interact with on a daily basis that you can begin to have these conversations with. And to me, that's the place where I think we can start to make some headway once we also do our own work simultaneously in that process.
So doing our own work, I think, is a really critical piece. And I think ACPA, at least for me, I've looked to ACPA to help with that, building knowledge, skills, competencies. Donna, can you talk a little bit about how you hope the association can build some capacity among the current membership to do racial justice work kind of within our spheres of influence? Mm-hmm. I think that is a really important piece to specifically talk about, since Stephen named it.
Right. No, and it is, and it's going to be a process. Mm-hmm. And we're in this like forming stage, and really just trying to figure out like where are our strengths, what resources do we already have, where are the gaps. What's going to be critical is the involvement of the membership across the board. Membership, I mean, not just the members, but the different entity groups, really just trying to leverage really a lot of the gifts are already out there. One thing that's going to be important, though, is that we're not looking at marginalized groups or targeted populations to do the heavy lifting. Where can we really just spread this out so there's a shared obligation to doing this work, and picking up where Stephen was talking about with some of the partnerships, where can we leverage some of those partnerships too, and work with them in building some of this capacity. So it is really going to take a process. Yeah,
for sure. And I think, it definitely involves different groups within the association as well. And we had a question from Twitter from Alex Lang about, how does the strategic imperative trickle down to coalitions and commissions? I find the hierarchical piece maybe is more horizontal, but Stephen, can you talk a little bit about the various groups within ACPA and how leaders, members, graduate students, new professionals, entity groups, foundation potentially can all play a role?
Sure. So let me start with ACPA leaders. So those are governing board members and other individuals who have leadership roles within our association. So I'll just echo some of the things I said previously. Like, I think it's important for us to do some of our own thinking around this issue, some of our own self-work around this issue, figuring out what this means for how we govern as a board. And some of that will start to happen at our July leadership meeting, where I'm hoping that we would spend some time really engaged in deep conversation, reflection around what racial justice means for how we show up as association leaders, and what our limitations are, what more knowledge do we need, just for us to think about what that means for us as a governing board. I always say to my students, like, I will never ask a student in my class to do something that I myself am not willing to do myself. And so for me, like, I can't expect members to be engaged in racial justice work if I am not simultaneously engaged in that work myself. So I think that's one piece. And I think ACPA members thinking about where racial justice exists in their day-to-day work. So what are the gaps in their policies and practices? Who's not named? Whose voices are not heard? I think thinking through some of those questions. When I think of like entity groups, I just want to build up one of the things that Donna said, which I think is really critical. The reality is, like, the entity groups, particularly the networks, APAN, the Pan-African Network, they are already doing this work on a daily basis. And so I don't pretend that suddenly now that we have this racial justice imperative, that the nature of their work is going to change dramatically. And I also don't expect them to do this work for us and have extra unpaid labor simply because they hold the title as identity-based networks. So I think that's also worth saying as well. And then finally, when I think of the foundation, I think of, for example, a recent example is, who are the speakers that the foundation is showcasing? What identities do they hold? How do they contribute to racial justice? I think when we think about that, those are the pieces that I think are really critical. Who's missing when we think of this work? Who are not in positions of power? What voices do we need to hear? So those are some of the questions that I think are really important to ask ourselves. And not only to ask ourselves those questions, but then to actually do something with those answers, to me is the next essential step in that process.
Yeah, for sure. So I just want to remind folks who are watching, we have a great back channel conversation going along, and I would definitely, if you have questions that you would like to insert or like us to insert in the conversation, please tweet at the hashtag HigherEdLive, and we will make sure we incorporate those. Dian, I know though that we have, as I mentioned in the intro, had some conversations already with members at the imagining sessions at the convention last month. Can you talk a little bit about the data, the conversations, what you learned from that process, and how that might inform going forward?
Sure. I want to comment quickly or add to the comments that were made just a second ago. I think part of the process is that we're all going to feel really uncomfortable at times, right? And we have to be able to think about why we're feeling uncomfortable in those spaces, and be okay with kind of continually being uncomfortable, right? Like, I talk about race and racism as part of my everyday life, and I still oftentimes feel uncomfortable in spaces, right? Like, we're always learning, we're always trying to do better, we're always doing our own work, and we have to be able to be really cognizant of that and not retreat when we're feeling challenged around something. I also, for me personally, I want us to steer clear of any sort of kinds of like credentialing that we might want to do around racial justice work. Like, I don't want people to say, I went to 3 sessions during Convention 18, and now I'm really good at doing racial justice. I don't think that that's the way to go. As I just mentioned, I think it's continually a process that we have to engage in. And so I want people to feel confident and comfortable, or not comfortable, but confident in like the fact that they're learning about how to be, how to do the work of social justice and racial justice better, but I don't want us to credential. But going to your question, so we had 3 collective imagining sessions, 1 each day during convention. And we had about 160 people-ish show up, which was great. So there was a lot of energy around this imperative. And that, that made us feel like we were moving in a good direction. I think people are excited. People are a little bit nervous, to be talking about this subject, as I just mentioned. Folks are looking for leadership, and they're looking for resources, which is all sort of things that we've talked about throughout this call. And I think ACPA and its members, so when I say ACPA, I mean like all of its members, are really poised to provide all of those things for the field of student affairs. If viewers want to see all of the feedback that we received at those sessions, as well as read about kind of the history and the status of what we're doing around this imperative, they can go to myacpa.org. And under the policy tab, there is a website for the strategic imperative on racial justice that lays out everything. Every single comment that we received in those sessions is posted on that website. And so there are a lot of great ideas. We asked questions around, what is racial justice? Who should be involved in these conversations, and what types of resources, programming, et cetera, should we be thinking about providing our members? And there's a lot of great information on there. There's some things that have already been started. And so it's kind of nice to recognize that the membership is kind of aligning with some of the work that the governing board is moving forward on, but there's still a lot of work to do. And our goal over the next year is to really kind of lay out that plan for the association and for the field more broadly.
So next steps, I'm curious about. You talked about summer leadership. What do we envision maybe moving forward? Stephen, Jamie is a current and next president in line. Talk a little bit about the next steps, I guess, that you'd see in the broader vision. Stephen, do you want to start?
Sure. I was going to ask Jamie to start since I feel like I've been doing a lot of talking, but.
But since you're leading, then you might start.
I'll start.
I will step behind Stephen.
Sounds good. So I think one of the next steps, I think I mentioned the July leadership meeting. That's a space where ACPA governing board members, as well as assembly entities, some convention planning committee members get together for face-to-face time. I think that's an important place in which for us as governing board members to start to engage around our role in this work. I resonated a lot with some of the things that Dian said around like the discomfort and that, so when I think of my dominant identities, for example, there's a lot of discomfort for me in those identities because I haven't been asked to think about them as frequently. So I empathize and acknowledge the challenge and the discomfort sometimes around talking about race. And so I think for us as governing board members, we'll do some of that work there. I mentioned the presidential symposium, and then for me, Houston Convention, I think is where might be another place in which to think about this. We're trying to think of a curriculum where we can have some longer sessions that are focused on having racial justice dialogues that would be facilitated. So that's just some ideas on the table. The other day, Chris Linder sent an email to me as well around a teach-in format that I am really intrigued with, just to have some more extended time to engage these issues beyond an hour-long presentation that is the typical format at conventions. So I think that is another piece that I'm excited about. And then I think the final thing that I'll say, at least for now on this point, is for me, one of the biggest points is how do we keep moving on this? And so we're trying to think of whether we call it a working group, whatever we want to call it, that's comprised of people from various places that is made up of just of an open call to people to see who wants to be involved in this work in the association. And I say working group with emphasis on working because we really want to keep engaged on this issue so that it's not just a task force that does a report and that just sort of collects dust, but that we're actually working to figure out what this might look like on a day-to-day basis and getting input from various places. So I would ask our membership to also be on the lookout for what this might look like down the road. But to me, that's like another immediate step of just deciding what this might look like so that we can continue doing this work on a daily basis.
Mm-hmm. Jamie?
I would enter, I think all of those things are right on. And the other piece that's important for me is and buy-in. So as we move forward, some of the next steps are really about helping. This experience here on Higher Ed Live is a part of steps, which is giving people an opportunity to hear from the leadership around what is it that we mean, right? So there's all kinds of, we had convention as an opportunity space where we had our imagining sessions. We had Stephen's presidential address. We've got Donna's letter. We've got all of these spaces where we're trying to get the word out about the importance. And what we're creating in these next year or two is about, right? So this is what we mean. This is what we're talking about. What do you understand? What are you hearing? What are you not? And so again, we will use all of the spaces that we get to, right? And we welcome any kind of feedback and applications to Higher Ed Lives, to conventions, to pitches, to our commissions, to assemblies, all of those space coalitions, all of those spaces are opportunities to really and get clear around, here's what we're saying when we talk about narrative. Any strategic talking about, what are we strategically trying to do? And so some of the first parts of the work is getting clarity. When we strategic plans, those plans are not often, yes, we have 1 year markers, here's the things that we want to do and next steps, but are getting in, right, and helping folks we're exactly the things we're doing right now. We want people to feel like they have access to the website, ask your questions, raise it, around the ways that we might move forward. Here's something that, you know, Stephen is there's all kinds of ways that I think that we as a want to be involved in thinking through how do we get a step of clarity. And then the next steps are then what it mentioned, the first level of looking at racial justice. What it's look like. How does that look in convention? How does that look like in publications? And so those are the things that we will be strategically thinking about. We are adding of a strategic initiative, and we will continue to explore those things in that way. What I want to, I do want to add is ACPA is a Student Affairs Higher Education Professional Association, International Professional Association. We have not shifted who we are. We are, in fact, an association that is, you can do student affairs if you're not doing racial justice. Mm-hmm. And I don't know, preparing the next generation of students them to engage through the lens of the world that they will go into, how that matters for our student leaders, how that matters for our residence halls, how that matters for career development, how that matters in all of the spaces that our students will engage us on campus. is important that folks are understanding as we talk about clarity, that no, we have not become NCORE. We are not the white privilege congregation to
Jamie, you're kind of breaking up on us a little bit. Is that happening for Donna and Stephen and Dian too?
It is.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
okay.
Jamie, I think what I heard you talking about actually though relates really effectively to a question that I received a couple of weeks ago, actually, when this episode was first announced. And so I think that your point in that ACPA at its core is a student affairs association is a really important one. And the question from John Wesley Lowry was related to that, you know, where in the new mission statement is that explicitly named? And how do we, you know, is this kind of this is related, but not necessarily directly on this topic? Do you or either any of you all on the call want to kind of follow up on that conversation?
Mm-hmm. I mean, first, I think it's important to clarify that the mission statement is in draft form right now. It was something that was shared with the membership to respond to, react to. The mission statement is owned by the membership. We do not have the ability to change the mission statement without the membership all buying in and voting on it. So I want to make sure that that is made clear. You know, and so the mission statement should be a reflection of who we are as a student affairs association. There was no, it wasn't intentional that student affairs was not included. And so I was happy to receive the feedback and input that really did generate a lot of discussion and energy. And I think that just confirms that, you know, people do see this as a student affairs association. And we are a student affairs association. I love what I think I heard, Jamie, as you were breaking up a bit, but I heard you say you cannot do student affairs without doing racial justice. You know, and so that's where I think the connection is. And so we will continue.
That's what I said.
Okay.
Yes.
So we'll continue to refine the mission statement and present it back to the membership. But the mission statement will not be changed until we as a membership all agree upon it.
Great. I think that's a great point. Thank you so much. I wanted to probably move towards final thoughts. And I think that I'm curious about a takeaway. We have had a fantastic back channel conversation, lots of good, important points being made around accountability. And so I would like to hear from each of you about what's one thing that you would like people who are watching today to think about or go away to look for, other resources that you'd point folks to. Higher Ed Live is never kind of a contained beginning and end of the conversation. So if folks want to continue the conversation, read more, would love to hear what your thoughts are on that. So who wants to start? I didn't create an order for this last question.
I can start because I just want to follow up quickly on the conversation about kind of next steps. So I also am serving as the Equity and Inclusion Chair for Convention 18. And since January, we've been having conversations around, you know, what might this strategic imperative mean for what convention as an experience is like. And so Stephen alluded to some of those conversations that have been happening, but they've been very intentional and very at the forefront of what we've been thinking about around our convention steering calls. And so, you know, currently in the shell, we're looking at holding caucus groups, intentional reflection spaces, as Stephen mentioned, extended sessions that, you know, are 3 hours long, that would be focused on racial justice topics, partnering with local organizations that do organizing and racial justice work within the Houston area, as well as thinking about how do we expand our education around MSIs, community colleges, and other institutional types that we don't often think about within our association as regularly as we should, and who are doing some great racial justice work. So just to kind of think about sort of what's happening next, but you know, there's a lot of conversation already happening. As somebody who identifies occasionally as an academic, I I'm always reading books, and so for me,
Only
a book,
occasionally.
Occasionally,
a book like little imposter syndrome sometimes. A book like Ebony and Ivy by Craig Stevens Wilder is always a great read, and a lot of higher ed programs, student affairs programs, are integrating that book into their history courses, and so I think that's a great book for folks to pick up. And I always love everything by Sarah Ahmed, including On Being Included, which talks about doing diversity work, but also racial diversity work on college campuses.
Mm-hmm.
And also check out the ACPA website, as I mentioned, around the Strategic Imperative website.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
So
Sarah Ahmed is.
I know that is.
Book.
It is.
Go ahead, Donna. Yeah.
So mine is, I guess, more a thought, not really resources. So as an occasional reflector, no, I'm teasing Dan. It was just I said this earlier, but I think I want to state it again. This is going to be a process, and it's going to be messy. And Dian mentioned that it's going to feel uncomfortable at times for all of us. But it is really going to take us trusting the process, trusting each other. It's going to take a willingness for us to give grace. It's going to take a willingness for us to give space for stories that might not have been heard before. It's going to take a willingness for us to be forgiving, and a lightness of touch. And I do have to say that my experience in ACPA has been that sometimes is a struggle for us. I think we have a really high bar for what we expect people to do and how they should show up. I'm not saying we lower the bar and we're lowering standards, but for us to be able to do this right, we're really going to have to create a space where people can stumble. We're going to mess up, and we need to be able to acknowledge that and do it together.
And let me just, I resonate a lot with what Donna just said. Let me just build off of that. So I forget, I'm teaching a diversity, equity, and dialogue class this semester, 2 sections of it. And it's basically a course around using dialogue as a form of communication to engage issues of privilege, power, and oppression. A few weeks ago in my class, the conversation came up around this notion of like giving grace, that when we're engaged in work around hard topics, in this case, racial justice, inevitably, we're not going to always know the right path forward. Mm-hmm. And so we need to enter that space knowing that what is our role in extending grace to folks in this process? And let me just tease out this grace a little bit more. So for example, I have a low patience at times when it comes to mess ups around race. I mentioned how race is a salient identity that I hold. I think a lot about my race on a daily basis. And so for me, my bandwidth around that is sometimes lower than it is with other identities that I hold. And it's because that's a subordinated identity that I hold. And at the same time, there are, even to this day, I still mess up in using the wrong pronouns for my trans and gender nonconforming colleagues and friends. And some of them have extended me grace when I have done that, and some of them have been more impatient with me. And it's not my right to ask them to extend me grace. Like, that is something that is freely given and chosen. But if I'm like the 15th person on a particular day who has messed up someone's pronoun, it's understandable why that 15th time might be just enough for that person on that one day. And so the conversation in my class was around this notion of like, you can't expect grace, and at the same time, we have to think about grace that is also rooted in our dominant identities, because those are the identities in which we often mess up and want grace in those identities. So if I'm asking for grace from my trans and gender nonconforming friends and colleagues, around that, then I have to extend grace to them around race as well. Otherwise, like I can't, to me, if I'm asking for grace, I also have to give it in this area. And it's been really humbling for me to just recognize that. And so to me, like that's, when I think of grace, I think of that. Like I don't ever expect grace from somebody, but at the same time, if I want grace from somebody, then I have to extend it as well. And so for me, that like that's one of the thoughts that I wanted to leave folks with, just that the complicated nature of grace, but then to also think about grace that is rooted in our dominant identities, because that's often the place at which we want grace from folks.
That's powerful.
Thank you.
Jamie, you have the final word.
Well, I just want to offer and say thank you again for this. This has been great. Thank you to each of my colleagues who are here, who are just wonderful soldiers in this work. And as I think about this, for me, the work forward is for us to remember, and I appreciate the comments around grace. I appreciate the understanding around we might not get it all right. We're trying to figure it out. But I like to leave folks with the understanding that this didn't start with us and it won't end with us. And so every generation has its opportunities to move the needle. And at this point in the association, at this contextual moment in time, we have an opportunity to move it forward and to do better. Do I think we're going to finish it? Like Stephen said, no, I don't think we're going to get it all done and get it all right or perfect and finished. But we do have an opportunity to leave our association, to leave our profession better than we found it. And so that's what I think a strategic imperative is about. Getting focused, getting clear that this is vital, such that we leave us better than we found us. And that's what I would like to say.
And not that we just say we're going to do better, but that we actually do better. Thank you to the four of you. I'm so grateful for you sharing time with us today on Higher Ed Live. This was a fabulous conversation. Thank you to everybody in the back channel who participated in the conversation. I think I will go back and reflect on many of those comments as well. And again, also thanks to our program sponsors, ACPA being one of them, and M. Stoner. So coming up in 2 weeks, I will be back again on Student Affairs Live, and I will be talking with Dr. Susan Comavez and Dr. Kathy Guthrie about their monograph series, New Directions in Student Leadership. We also hope to be joined by a few of the individual volumes editors, so you can receive information about that and other episodes here on the Student Affairs Live website at higheredlive.com. Again, I'm Heather Shea. Thanks again to our fabulous panelists and to everybody watching. Make it a great week, everyone. Bye-bye.